Well, we want to welcome everyone to the Pollinator Habitat Design and Research Program tonight. We're glad you're here to join us to hear more about research related to pollinator habitat. This is one of a series of webinars the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund is hosting to increase engagement and build more excitement around creating great pollinator habitat. My name's Elsa Gallagher, and I'm the Habitat Program Director for the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund, and I am coming to you tonight from the Show Me State, Missouri. We've got an excellent program for you with two very accomplished and passionate presenters. Joining us today from the beautiful Loess Hills of Nebraska is the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund Executive Director, Pete Berthelsen. And joining us from the outskirts of Jamestown, North Dakota is Dr. Clint Otto. Dr. Otto, or Clint as we like to call him on our team. Hi, Clint. Clint is a research ecologist for the U.S. Geological Survey out of the Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center in Jamestown, North Dakota. His most recent research has focused on measuring the benefits of conservation plantings for pollinators, the results of which he's going to be sharing with you here tonight. Before we begin, we'd love to see where you're from. So if you would open your chat function, you're going to use the chat function one time tonight, and that is going to be to tell us your name and where you're from. If you want to say who you're affiliated with, if you're a beekeeper, that's great too, but you'll put that in the chat function. Now, the rest of the night, if you have any questions, you'll be using the Q&A function. So chat your location, where you're from, just gives us a little information. And then when you go to the Q&A function later for questions, we're going to do our best to get as many questions answered as we can. We've received several questions already that were emailed in, but we're also going to try and answer the questions that you give us tonight. We're going to wrap up the presentations within an hour, and the questions will be answered afterwards. So Pete, I'm going to let you take it from here.
All right. Thank you, Elsa. And Clint, looking forward to this. You and I, every time we get together, we get into the nitty-gritty talking about habitat and pollinators and management and design and all that kind of stuff. And we're going to be able to show some of the really cool research that your team has come up with. So I'm really looking forward to tonight's conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Pete, for the invite. And I am too. I mean, and looking at the chat real quick, gosh, people from all over the place. I mean, maybe yeah. I haven't seen Alaska yet. So if somebody's out there from Alaska, please put in the chat. And I hope this is a very informative and entertaining hour with all of you.
Yeah. And so this is the second one. We do a morning one. This is the evening one when people are watching this. And we had over 40 questions from the morning one. So I'm going to get going, and I'm going to go as fast as I can through my part, because I know we're going to get just as many questions tonight as well. So with that, Clint, here we go on this journey. And I want to start tonight by just telling people a little bit about who the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund is, because I think lots of people that are on the webinar tonight that are interested in this topic have maybe never heard of it before. And some of what you're going to talk about tonight is looking at the pollinator value and results from Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund projects. They'll be part of what you talk about. So I want to tell people just a little bit of a story of who we are. We're a young nonprofit that was formed really out of a sense of we feel like we can design pollinator habitat projects to get a little higher quality and a little higher value for pollinator species using some innovation and experiences that we've learned in designing, establishing, and managing pollinator habitat. And anybody can participate with our program here that is in our area that works with projects that are 2 acres in size or larger. And we provide free pollinator seed mixtures. It's open to private land, public land, corporate land, which people should interpret as any land. Simple online process, and we provide one-on-one technical guidance. So Clint, I'm sure in your career like me, you've heard the story, there's no such thing as a free lunch. This is pretty close. This is close. All right, so here we go. So a bee and butterfly habitat fund project is innovative and unique in that when we work on a project, we actually provide 2 different seed mixtures for every project that we work on. I don't know of any other conservation program that does that. It's really innovative and unique. And the first seed mixture that I'll describe to you is what we call a honeybee seed mixture. This is actually a photo from one of Clint's plots that was included in the study results that he's going to talk about. And this was just about 2 months after it was planted. The honeybee mix includes species like clovers and things that establish very, very quickly. High pollinator value, lots of nectar, lots of pollen, establishes quickly. Native bees, honeybees, butterflies, all kinds of pollinator species love it and enjoy it. Okay, that's one mixture. The second mixture is kind of like the more traditional pollinator seed mixture that people think about. 100% native, 100% designed for that state or that region. And there are a minimum of 40 wildflower species in every one of the mixtures. Really, it's probably more like 60 to 70, but 40 is the floor. We don't go below 40. But these seed mixtures established very, very differently. And oftentimes we describe their establishment as in year 1, it sleeps, in year 2, it creeps, and in year 3, it leaps. Lots of value. Pollinator species use both seed mixtures, but they're planted separately. They're not mixed together. They're planted separately because they establish so very differently. And let me give you an example of how that might work. And in my example, we're going to look at if somebody said, hey, I have 6 acres and love to work with you. Example number 1 is we divide that field in half, and 3 acres of it we plant to one mix, and 3 acres of it we plant to another mix. And Clint, this was how you established your plots. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's at Northern Prairie. This is kind of the design we have implemented for our research plots. Yes.
Yep. So the next option, and probably one that we recommend a lot, is we could take that same 6-acre area and establish it in a different format where we actually plant the honeybee mix around the outside of the project and the monarch butterfly mix in the middle. And if you're looking at that and you're wondering, well, why would you want to do that? Think about something like a castle with a moat around it. And that honeybee mix functions like the moat around the castle. It can be a green fire break so that if we want to put prescribed fire on that monarch butterfly mix, which is a great management tool, we can do it more safely because that honeybee mix functions like a green fire break. And this is a really important point that I think Clint will probably talk about as well, is that we have to provide some form of management to all of our projects. There's nothing we can do where we plant it, walk away from it, and always have great habitat. So there's a number of other ways that we can do that. If somebody raises their hand and says, man, I'd like to do this, but I can't get to your floor of 2 acres. Well, one of the things that we really try to do is if there is a high likelihood of a good pollinator outcome, we work very hard to find a reason to say yes to a project. So we could also do something where, say, you have 1 acre and on the other side of the fence, your adjoining neighbor or neighbors also have additional land that they would put in. We can kind of combine those pieces to get to that 2 acre minimum. Again, we want to say yes if it has a high likelihood of a good pollinator outcome. So there's lots of different ways in which we can work and establish projects. Private landowners are probably our bread and butter, where we do most of that, but we're working with cities and municipalities, a corporate campus, road right-of-ways, utility right-of-ways, solar energy projects, hike bike trails, and working with agriculture. So just to give you a little snippet of kind of the width and the breadth of that horizon that we're working with. But I want to give you one more real specific example, because I think it shows how innovatively and uniquely we can work with projects. And I want to talk about solar energy. Lots of new solar energy projects going in all across the country. And this is a really unique opportunity where our pollinator habitat design projects can fit really well with solar energy. Here's what I mean. Every solar energy project is going to have a really important consideration. And that consideration is, how high is the lower panel above the ground? And it is common for projects to have different heights, but on large utility scale solar projects, it's kind of about the industry standard to be 20 to 24 inches off the ground. Smaller solar projects, sometimes 3 feet, 4 feet off the ground. Well, when we're designing a vegetative cover to go into a solar array project, we want to select plant species that will not grow taller than that lower panel height. Well, if we have an example of where we want to pick something that doesn't grow taller than 20 inches, well, guess what? About 90 to 95% of the tools in the toolbox, what we could use, are out the door and not an option. But our honeybee mix and how that can be designed can work really well. So the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund works with utility scale solar projects to design them to use our 2 seed mixture approach on a solar project just like this one that is a real world project. So in this example, these black squiggly lines, that's where the panels are, the solar panels. And everything you see that's kind of this pinkish color right here is designed to a solar array mix. And when you think of that, think about our honeybee mix, because we can use a combination of grasses and clover that won't grow taller than 20 inches, provides great pollinator value. And then in the areas of the project that are a large enough size and don't have any panels over them, we can plant our more traditional pollinator mix, that honeybee mix that grows much taller and has a lot more diversity. So a project shortly after planting within the array can look like this, where we have a number of clover species in there. And Clint's gonna tell us a little bit about some of the results of clover species in his study. And then outside of that array area, we can plant the more traditional, more diverse pollinator mix where we don't have to worry about growing taller than a lower panel height. And I just, as I lead it up to Clint's opening here, and I hand it over to him right now, I want to let you know that the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund has 4 different research projects that are looking at our seed mixtures and kind of documenting the pollinator value of them. And the longest tenured one is the plan, or the study that Clint is going to talk to us about right now. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to hand it over to Clint. And Clint is going to take over to talk about his team's exciting research here tonight. And while Clint is pulling that up, I'll tell you that he is going to reference a number of different documents tonight. As those references come up, if you check the chat function, we should be dropping hyperlinks to that information into the chat. So Clint, take it away, please.
All right. Thanks, Pete. Pete, give me the thumbs up if you see my screen. Are you good? Okay.
Gotcha.
Excellent. All right. And certainly I'd like to thank the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund for giving me opportunity to present my team's research today. As Pete alluded to, this work was supported in part through the Honeybee Health Coalition and also the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And it focuses pretty much exclusively on research to improve the cost effectiveness of conservation plantings to benefit pollinators. And before I get into the details of the research, I'd like to share my thanks for Stacy Simononik, who led most of this research. Stacy'd likely be the one presenting this today, but she's on parental leave currently, so you get me instead. All right, so a little bit of background. I'm not going to talk tonight any about bee threats and pollinator declines. I think most of us know about the primary threats that our honeybees and our wild bees face in the US. But I did see in the chat that people are coming from all across the country, which is great. So I just want to give you a little bit of a scenario about what's going on in the place where I live, the Northern Great Plains. And there, forage loss driven by land use change is the principal threat to both managed bees, so our honeybees, and wild bees alike. And I have here a map that was developed by the US Department of Agriculture, and it shows different parts of the US where the forage value on the landscape is changing through time. And so any area in red or yellow are places where forage value is declining. And the authors of this report went so far as to kind of highlight the Northern Great Plains, principally North and South Dakota, because of the abundant and rapid land use changes taking place there, the decline in forage value, and the importance of that area to the commercial beekeeping industry, as well as native bees. And I'll just mention that my team did an independent assessment of this USDA report, and we found that over 500,000 acres of grassland was converted to cropland since 2006 in just North and South Dakota alone. So rapid land use change causing a decline in pollinator forage. And we know that the forage is declining in this region that also happens to support the highest density of honeybee colonies in the entire country. I mean, this is kind of the Northern Great Plains is kind of America's honeybee factory. The graph on the left shows US honeybee colony density. And you can see there, again, the states in Northern Great Plains, highest colony density in the US. And we also know it primarily in North and South Dakota, where we have good data, there's continued growth in the number of honeybee colonies that are trucked here every year. And that's shown on the right. So the vertical axis there is number of honeybee colonies, and the horizontal axis is year. And as you can see, as we go through time, we get closer and closer to present. We see more and more honeybee colonies in the Dakotas. And in North Dakota, that's a pretty rapid increase there. And just sort of, we say in a couple of years, we're going to have more honeybee colonies in North Dakota than we will people. So a lot of bee activity there. And because of the Pete, do you have a question?
Yeah, I know the answer to this because I've heard you say it, and I actually have a Post-it note on my wall right here with your quote. Why, but I want you to comment on this if you would, please. Why are so many beekeepers going to the Dakotas?
Well, I mean, the Dakotas have been a multi-generational destination for beekeepers. It really has. And more recently, the rapid increase has a lot to do with the need for bees to produce a valuable honey crop. Of course, beekeepers want to make honey, but more recently it has to do with also helping the bees heal from the migratory or the stresses of the migratory pollination circuit. So a lot of these bees in the Dakotas are trucked to the California almond orchards, and they're woke up in pretty much what they think is the dead of winter, and they're forced to pollinate an almond crop. Well, that can be pretty stressful on a honeybee. And so this is kind of the safe pasture ground for bees to gain a bit of relief or a respite from that pollination circuit. So big time honey production. North Dakota's #1 in honey production, and also safe pasture for bees to get some rest and relaxation.
I was looking for the quote that this is the last best place on the landscape.
Okay. Well, yes. And I've heard other I actually stole that from a beekeeper here in North Dakota, John Miller. And John Miller mentions that North Dakota used to be the best place to keep honeybees, and now it's the least worst because forage is just declining elsewhere. It's declining all over the place. Okay, so because of all this change and the importance of the Northern Great Plains for keeping bees, the Dakotas have become this sort of primary focus of pollinator conservation efforts. And over the past several years, I've had the great pleasure in my team working with USDA and the Honeybee Health Coalition, Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund on several different projects with the big kind of overarching theme of understanding bee forage to improve conservation delivery. And so just a quick definition about pollinator habitat. I'll mention a lot during the talk: pollinator habitat, pollinator forage. They're kind of synonymous, but not totally. But basically, when I say pollinator habitat, we're talking about an area that provides flowers for bees, and those flowers in turn provide pollen and nectar. So nectar being the primary source of carbohydrates, and pollen being that source of protein, fatty acids, and essential micronutrients and so forth. Wild bees also need a place to nest. And so pollinator habitat provides that. In this image, you can see kind of through the flowers, you can see a lot of bare ground. And that's great nesting habitat for a lot of ground nesting bees. And then also large pieces of grass that have hollowed out stems, or even small trees and shrubs that have holes drilled by wood-boring beetles. That's where cavity nesting bees are going to nest over the winter as well. So those native bees require that nesting habitat in addition to having great forage. And pollinator habitat comes in a variety of shapes, types, sizes, but in general, we're talking about herbaceous or woody plants that provide some sort of pollen and nectar resource or nesting habitat. And so what I hope to leave with all of you today is kind of how my team approaches about thinking about what makes for good pollinator habitat. And that is to say, what makes for choosing a particular flower species or a forb species that's going to be a wise investment in a pollinator conservation planting. And we fully acknowledge there's going to be multiple conservation and site-specific objectives that we're going to have to consider when designing mixes. Pete, you mentioned, solar arrays there. Your toolbox is kind of shrunk because you have to deal with these arrays and you have to select the right flowers. And that's what we're talking about, site-specific objectives. So I don't drill down in the details there about site-specific objectives, but here kind of the Mile High approach, what we think about for pollinator habitat is forbs that have high establishment success, low seed cost, and they're flowers that are preferred by bees, so that they are actually, you have stuff that blooms, it's relatively cheap. Not all these seeds are cheap, but it's relatively cheap, and it's biologically impactful. That is, bees are going to use it and they're going to love it. So that's kind of the three pillars or three bubbles of what my team thinks about when we think about good pollinator habitat. All right, so with that background in mind, here are my team's research objectives. First, we want to determine flowering plants that are preferred by honeybees and wild bees in the Northern Great Plains. And this work definitely closely aligns with other parts of the country. We might not have the same, we might not share the same forbs, the same flowers, but you can definitely see how this approach would be very useful for documenting preferred plants in other parts of the US. And then we're going to, for our second objective, my team wanted to quantify flowering plant abundance across multiple land cover types, and then also estimate the total flower abundance across our entire study region of a large portion of the Northern Great Plains in the US. And so here we want to know how many flowers are out there on the landscape as a good baseline, so that in the future, when we have national conservation targets for improving pollinator health and improving pollinator habitat, we kind of need to know where we are, what's our baseline, if we can actually have a goal of achieving, say, putting X number of flowers or X acres of habitat on the landscape. So our third objective is characterizing the relationship between seed mix design and forb establishment, specifically focused on USDA, US Department of Agriculture conservation covers. But again, although we focused on USDA covers, the way we approach the research and the results have application to the design of seed mixes for a variety of agencies, NGOs, including Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund. And Pete, feel free as we go through, if you see some of these in Objective 3 that kind of forbs that you've included in your mixes, please feel free to point that out. All right, so what is preference? There's a lot of habitat guides for pollinators that are out there, but many of the recommended forbs are based on anecdotal observations, based on bee visits. People see bees visiting a flower and they think, hey, that's a good pollinator. And a lot of times they may be right, or that's fair. But we also point out that forbs may simply be visited either because they're highly abundant on the landscape, or it's kind of the only thing that's out there for the bees to utilize. And this is where preference really comes into play. That's why we want to know what things are preferred. Preference means a flower species is visited more than you would expect based on the availability or abundance of that flower species. And so an example from our own human diet, you may prefer the last remaining cinnamon roll on the table versus a whole pile of breakfast bars, even though that those breakfast bars are more abundant in your pantry. And Pete, I know in the last talk, I used cinnamon roll as the example. It was a crowd pleaser, but do you have another favorite breakfast item that you highly prefer?
No, that's right up there, Clint. It's
Okay,
right
very
up there.
good. Good, very excellent. All right, so that's just an example of what I mean by preference. So to study bee preference, we used a 5-year data set where we collected over 8,000 records of bees visiting flowers. And we did this at approximately 250 different sites or fields. We went out and sampled bees in a variety of land use types, including conservation reserve program land, environmental quality incentives program land, bee and butterfly habitat fund sites, roadside ditches, grass, pasture, and other federal and state lands. Basically, hey, if it was grassland and or pollinator habitat, we attempted to survey it. And at each site, we established a number of transects and then went out and counted flowers on those transects and also counted wild bees and honeybee visits. And then I should mention, we sampled each transect 3 times per year so we could get an idea of what's blooming early, mid, and late season, and ultimately what the bees preferred. So to understand preference, what we did is we calculated what we call a selection ratio. And we did it for each forb at a particular site. And the math is definitely more involved than what I'm going to give you the overview here, but basically we compare the proportion of flowers that were used by bees to the proportion of flowers that were not used by bees. And this slide provides sort of a pretty simplified example of a selection ratio. So imagine that there's a field with 2 different flowering forbs, and the forb on the right, that's the one in the yellow box there. We counted 3 forbs and 3 bees visiting those forbs. And the other forb, the one on the left, that's in the red box, that is much more abundant than the first forb. And that one actually had 1 more bee visit, that it has had 4 bee visits. And by calculating the selection ratio, we find that the bees use the forb on the right, so the one surrounded by the yellow box, significantly more than would be expected given that flower's availability, meaning that it's preferred. And we also say for the flowers in the red box, those forbs were underutilized relative to their abundance. So for our analysis, we calculate this selection ratio at each site and across this 3-state region, and we get a pretty good picture of what flowers are preferred. And this selection ratio, again, tells you if it's preferred, avoided, or it has neutral selection. All right, so jumping into the results. For wild bees, we had about 1,880 wild bees that were observed on flowers. And they observed about 83, we observed those wild bees on 83 different forb species. And 29 of the wild bee observations were actually on introduced or non-native forbs. And that's to say then that the other 71%, those were all on native flowers. So wild bees, most vast majority of them were native, visiting native forbs. Makes sense. Honeybees, on the other hand, we observed over 6,000 honeybees on flowers on 70 different forb species, and 80% of those visits were on introduced or non-native flowers. And then 20% were on native flowers. So going to just share with you the results from some of our preference work. And this is broken up into 3 time periods. So I hope you can see my mouse here hovering over the screen. We have early, mid, and late season. And the vertical line here, shown here, this vertical line, that represents a neutral selection ratio. So any plant to the right of the line represents one with a positive selection ratio, which we can say is preferred by the bees. And so for simplicity, I'm just showing the preferred plants because if we included all of those plants with a neutral or avoided selection function, the graph would just be way too busy. So the circles, these circles here depict introduced or non-native flowers, and any triangle here is a native species. So take home point here, we found 5 forbs that were introduced were preferred by wild bees, and the remaining 9 on this list are native forbs. And a couple of the native forbs are Maximilian sunflower, blanket flower, upright coneflower, and as you can see, there are several others here. However, I'd like to point out that there's also 4 thistle species on here, 3 of which are non-native, and they're also considered invasive in a lot of areas. You see here, bull thistle, for example, huge positive selection ratio, but also it can be extremely invasive. And so here we're not necessarily showing people what they want to hear when it comes to pollinator forage. We're documenting the reality of what's out there on the landscape and what the bees actually like.
Hey, Clint.
Yes.
Because you asked about this, I'll just pass along that out of the preferred native species that you have listed there, there's only 1 that would not be included in one of our seed mixtures. And
Okay.
that's Flodman's thistle.
Yep.
And that's a conscious decision, would love to do it, but not everybody can tolerate having a thistle in their planting, whether it's a native thistle or not. And so anyway, the rest of them are all in there.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. And that, yeah, the tolerance of thistle, totally understandable. That said, we're learning, we're beginning to learn, especially for bumblebees, the tremendous importance of thistle
and monarch butterflies for migration.
Okay, so on to honeybees, honeybee preference. So here the graph is not nearly as busy. And the take-home message here is we basically have 4, maybe 5 species on here. We got anise hyssop, Canada thistle, yellow sweet clover, and blanket flower. I don't believe I'm missing any there. And you can see kind of across the growing season, the same species kind of pop up. Anise hyssop shows up throughout the growing season, as does sweet clover, Canada thistle, which of course is not going to be included in anyone's seed mix, nonetheless being highly preferred by honeybees. That pops up a couple times. So we're seeing that these species have tremendous value to our managed honeybee colonies in the northern Great Plains. Pete, do you have any other comments you'd like to make just based off?
I would just say that again, 100% of the natives that you have listed here would be represented in our seed mixture. And just as a practitioner that designs seed mixtures and gets into all of the minutia of that, I smile and I kind of nod my head when I see things like anise hyssop that is in all 3 bloom periods, and how incredibly unique that is. One, that it's a plant that can have such an extended bloom period. And number 2, it appears to me that those bee species are so desirous of the floral value of that plant that they're out there looking for it everywhere on the landscape that they can get it, because it's, in that early bloom period, it's not very abundant. Anise hyssop is not going to be very abundant in that first bloom period. So as soon as it's available, they're looking for it and they're using it.
Yeah, bees really gravitate, the honeybees really gravitate to it. And I should mention too that blanket flower is the only one that shows up on both of these preference lists for honeybees and wild bees.
Yeah.
Everything else, there's not much overlap there.
And I would add, Clint, that from my personal observation, bumblebees just lose their mind over anise hyssop. So it didn't, it might not have popped out that way in this study, but like in our production plots that we have here, bumblebees just, they go crazy for it.
All right, and so for anyone, I think this is my cue, Mary, to highlight where you might put this in the chat, a link to our fact sheet. So we produced a sort of a friendly version of our research that highlights the forbs that are preferred. It actually includes a few more additional preferred forbs on this fact sheet. But Mary, if you'd be willing to put that in the chat, and that's free to all. It's a government document, so please feel free to check that out.
And there we go. It's in there.
Okay, great. So on to the second objective of quantifying flower abundance across multiple land cover types. So to my knowledge, this is the first ever time anyone's attempted to estimate the total number of flowers in a region, and also to quantify flower abundance across multiple land cover types to sort of get an idea of the ecological footprint that different land cover types have in terms of contributing to pollinator habitat on the landscape. And we did this because one of the basic questions land managers often have about pollinator habitat is, hey, if we plant more diverse, more expensive seed, what do we really get out of it? That is, how does pollinator habitat function relative to all the other land cover types that are already present on the landscape? So to address this question, my team considered, we want to look at flower abundance across what we call 3 broad land categories: pollinator habitat, conservation grassland, and general grassland. And pollinator habitat is all of the pictures, the stuff that Pete is talking about with the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund. It also includes other practices like Conservation Reserve Program, Practice 42, pollinator habitat. This is the stuff that people put on the landscape with a specific objective of benefiting pollinators. Then we have what we call conservation grassland, and that includes land that people want to make a concerted effort to have some sort of, to establish wildlife habitat or have some sort of conservation-based objective, but it doesn't necessarily include pollinators as a focal organism or a priority organism in sort of the conservation plan. So this could be things like CRP that's not in pollinator habitat. It could be other USDA program lands. It could be waterfowl production areas. It could be grassland easements. And then finally, we have general grassland. And this is all the sort of remaining stuff out there that doesn't really have a conservation-based objective, but it might provide, it probably provides some level of pollinator habitat nonetheless. And this is pasture, roadside ditches, hayland, and I might be missing a couple others there, but those are the majority. So that's what we're calling general grassland. And we went out and we did flower surveys on all these different land cover types across a 3-state region. So I'm going to jump now into the results right away. And I'll describe you what you're looking at because there's a lot of words that appear on this graph. So on the vertical axis, we have flower abundance per study unit. And on the horizontal axis, we have our 3 land category types that are broken up in early, mid, and late portions of the growing season. So this first gray box here is all the early season flowers. The middle box is the mid-season flowers, and the late column, those are our late season flowers. So the salmon colored bars are for our introduced or non-native forbs, and the blue bars are the native plants. So a couple things to pay attention to here. First, pollinator habitat across the board had the most abundant flowers across the 3 time periods. So this is when we're conducting research at a site level where we control for the area of the site. So the area of the site is all the same, and we're counting flowers in a confined area. And when we do that, we're seeing engineered pollinator habitat by far and away provides more flowers, both non-native and native flowers. This is, of course, as you can see, most pronounced in the early portion of the growing season. Secondly, we see that all of the habitats that we looked at, all these land cover types, non-native flowers were more abundant than native flowers, and that occurred throughout the entire growing season. And this is kind of indicative of the northern Great Plains. I mean, these are working lands. We're not going out into any areas that are near designated wilderness or even national grasslands. We're targeting working land, private lands that are there in an agricultural landscape. So these are working lands. And then thirdly, notice the flower abundance, how it decreases through time across all these different covers. Flowers are most limited late season. And then we're kind of right now in that late season. And you can see the flowers out there on the landscape. A lot of them are beginning to senesce. Some of the goldenrods and asters are just coming online right now, but a lot of stuff is already senesced. So now we're going to take a more detailed look into some of the specific programs and practices. And here, bear with me, I'm going to again describe the graph. The vertical axis is mean flowers per transect. And the horizontal axis here is the total area of land cover within our 3-state study region. And the units here are on the log scale in hectares. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, all right. So we estimated that, for example, I'll just highlight here. See grass pasture? The x-axis shows it's about 16. So 16 hectares on the log scale roughly translates to about 8.9 million hectares or 22 million acres. So we are saying on this graph, there's 22 million acres of grassland within our study region. So take home message here, anything that's pretty much on the right half of this graph, there's a lot of land of that type out there. So there's a lot of grassland and pasture, a lot of CRP, WPAs, roadside ditches, and wildlife management areas. But on a per unit area, these lands don't support nearly half the number of flowers, again, per unit area, as something like CP 42, which is Conservation Practice 42 pollinator habitat, and bee and butterfly habitat fund sites. So these two, the engineered pollinator habitat that we're looking at, they have a small landscape footprint, but per unit area, they have the most significant biological impact in terms of putting flowers out there on the landscape. All right, so now we're going to scale up to the entire sort of what we call the prairie pothole region, and that's eastern North Dakota, eastern South Dakota, and western Minnesota. We didn't really go into Iowa in this case, but here we're reporting on our estimates of the total number of flowers that are out there on an annual basis. And this was a monumental undertaking, doing a lot of geographic information system analyses that I won't even dare to attempt to explain here, but we brought in a lot of computer modeling, GIS data with our field transect data and came up with these estimates. We're making a lot of assumptions here, but nonetheless, this is kind of our best scientific guess as to how many flowers are out there annually. So for engineered pollinator habitat, we estimate that there's about 200, that habitat type puts out 257 million flowers per year in our study region. Conservation grassland puts out 39 billion flowers, and general grassland puts out 179 billion flowers. So recall in the previous slides, on a per unit area, pollinator habitat provides more than double the number of flowers than our grassland categories, but it still only represents here less than 1% of the number of flowers relative to our other grassland types. So really teeny tiny ecological footprint, but there's potential there. It has biological impact. It's just really rare on the landscape. So Pete, before I jump into I think this is the last slide for my objective 2. Do you have a comment?
We need more bee and butterfly habitat fund acres on the landscape. That's my observation and comment. It rocks and we need more of it.
Very good. We absolutely, that map of the forage loss across the US, there's not many places where we're gaining forage for bees. I mean, we know the land use trends. We are requiring more natural lands being converted for fuel, food, and fiber. And so we really need pollinator habitat in all shapes and forms. We need it out there on the landscape. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so going into the last objective here, and this is characterizing the relationship between the seed mix design and forb establishment, specifically on USDA conservation covers. And I realize I'm getting a little bit long here, so I'm going to kind of zip through some of these slides here. So our principal question for this research was first to determine which seeded forbs do we most often see after planting. That is, which ones have the highest rates of establishment success? And then which forbs are most cost effective? And here we're trying to identify those forbs that have high establishment success and at a low cost. So those are our primary questions. And basically what we ended up doing is we went out on a lot of USDA conservation covers. We surveyed the flowers that were out there, and then we contacted local USDA offices and tracked down the actual seed mix list to find out what was planted, and we could compare that with what actually bloomed out there on the conservation land. And so by combining that information on establishment and seed costs, then we're and I should mention, we also tracked down seed cost information, contacting seed vendors, and NRCS gave us some seed cost information as well. So we can combine this sort of establishment rate success with information about seed costs to determine cost effectiveness. All right, so here I'm going to really oversimplify our research results. And this table is showing establishment rates and seed costs for 30 different forb species. The take-home point is, hey, there are quite a few forbs out there, 16 to be exact, that have high establishment success and low cost. And I'll share with you the next slide. I'll kind of tell you a little bit about what those species are. But we also saw that there are several species that have low establishment rates and low cost. So those we don't deem as really necessarily as cost effective, because you don't always see a return on the investment. That is, those species, for whatever reason, don't establish well. You can buy them cheap, but they just don't establish well in these private land conservation programs. And then we have two forbs that had high cost and high establishment rate. So if a landowner is willing to put a little extra money into their seed mix, hey, these species do okay, but they're not as cost effective as these other 16. And then we have 4 that we say, no, these are just, they're not worth it, at least within these program lands, because they cost a lot of money. Like some of them are $600 per 100,000 seeds, which is an exorbitant amount. And they have low establishment rate. And so Mary, if you want to, here's the plug to put the paper in the chat. If you're interested on sort of the list of the species that are represented in this table, please consult that paper. And again, if you'd like, I can send you a personal copy of the paper if you send me an email as well. Okay, so what are some of these species? And this kind of wraps up my research here, the research I'm highlighting here. So again, as I started, we want to identify plants that have high establishment success, low seed costs, and flowers that are preferred by bees. So if you're wondering what species are actually cost effective, take a photo of this slide right here. So this is based off of our 5-year research. We identified these following plants, which I will not name in the interest of time, but we put in the parentheses there, we have honeybees, so HB is honeybee and WB is wild bee. Because again, wild bees and honeybees, based on our research, they prefer different plants. So a cost-effective mix, you're going to design one for honeybees probably. And if you have an objective of native bees, your mix is going to look very different. So here are the results of our research in terms of cost effectiveness. Just wrapping it up. This is my last slide here, Pete. Wild bees visited mostly native flowers, while honeybees visited mostly non-native flowers. So there's a degree of dietary niche partitioning, if I may. Honeybees and wild bees exhibited a degree of separation when we're talking about the floral resource preference as well. Keep in mind, blanket flower was the only one of the species that we'd actually potentially include in the seed mix that was preferred by both honeybees and wild bees. Otherwise, there was separation there. And then thirdly, engineered pollinator habitat has higher floral abundance than other grassland types, but it's got that small ecological footprint. So lots of potential there for pollinator habitat, but it's, again, pretty rare on the landscape. It is now, but maybe not if Pete has a say in it. So, and then finally leave you with, not all forbs establish equally well. And that's what our research has really shown. Some of these plants are not as cost effective as others. And so including that establishment success, seed cost, and preference are those three pillars or three bubbles that we consider when we talk about engineering better, more cost-effective bee habitat. And so with that, I'd like to thank the following agencies and organizations for their support in the research. And we also had a number of research cooperators and collaborators that I'd like to thank, and they're listed here. In the interest of time, Pete, I think I'll probably turn it back over to you.
Okay.
I'll stop sharing my screen, and then I think you have a wrap up, and then maybe some questions. Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. So bear with me, sir. I'm having a little bit of a challenge. Oh, here, I got to go to the other screen. Sorry. Okay, there you go.
Modern technology, Clint. All right, and hopefully everybody's able to see my screen right now. Is that correct, Clint?
Yep, we're good.
Yep. Okay, so I'm just going to conclude with kind of giving you some foundational thoughts. And for those of you that haven't picked it up, Clint and I kind of go back a ways. And every time we're together, we just love talking about this kind of stuff. So from my knowledge throughout my career of designing, establishing, and managing habitat, and talking with really smart people like Clint and learning from his team, the things that he said tonight, we kind of have 9 foundational thoughts that drive what we do when it comes to designing and putting pollinator habitat on the ground. And I just kind of want to hit some of those. And the first one is the importance, the uber importance of thinking about the art and science of before you do anything. In one of Clint's presentation or his slides there, he had the 3 circles and he talked about site-specific objectives. That's what we're talking about here. Think about, before you do a pollinator project, think about what it is you want to accomplish. Some people might be, I raise bees and I want to mostly benefit my honeybees. Okay, that's an objective. Some people might be, I'm solely interested in managing a prairie that we have, or only native plants, or whatever your objectives are, or I don't have equipment to do this kind of management. You just have to think about all of those different factors before you do anything. And the good news is that the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund has developed a pollinator habitat establishment and management guide that's available free to everybody. We'll pop a link to it in our chat right now, and you can get that, and it will walk you through many of these early decision processes that you need to make. So we need to think about what the art and science is, what our objectives are before we do anything. The next one, and Clint's team just hit this out of the park. Not all pollinator habitat is created equal. I've said that for a decade, and I say it because sometimes people see something that is flowering and they think, oh, that's, great pollinator value. Not always the case. Some plants have higher pollinator value than others, and we want to be working to make sure that we're including species in a seed mixture that are going to produce great pollinator results. The next thing is that I believe personally, if we try to solve big, hairy, audacious problems with pollinator health and habitat, doing things the exact same way we've been doing them for the last decade, we will fail. And here's what I mean by that. If you take a look at the index that is created each winter for the eastern monarch butterfly population when they migrate. The fourth generation migrates to that mountaintop in central Mexico, and they estimate how many are there. And then you consider that the Fish and Wildlife Service estimates that red line is where the population, the bare minimum number for that population needs to be for that population to continue to be successful and be able to migrate and things like that. We're well below it, and we've been below it for far too long a period of time. That's where the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund develops and puts on the ground what we call next gen habitat projects that produce some of the results that Clint was talking about in his results. One other same example related to honeybees. If we try to solve this problem doing the same things we've been doing for the last decade, we're not going to make it. This graph is something that shows the annual honeybee hive losses. Okay. And for the last decade, we've been kind of between 40 and 60% annual losses. The red line is what the beekeeping industry considers to be the line of sustainability. They can handle annual losses of about 15%, but above that, it becomes very questionable whether it's even a sustainable industry that we have out there in the country. So, you know, think about any business or hobby or something that you're involved in where you have 40 to 60% annual losses and whether or not that would be sustainable. Pretty tough. The next foundational thought is that I think this is a really unique moment in time. A unique moment in time where the public has a heightened level of understanding that honeybees, native bees, butterflies are in a state of crisis and that there are habitat and health considerations. Just as an example, if you get the New York Times to write a paper about monarch butterflies, that kind of shows that there's a high level of interest out there. And I think the public has very clearly said, one, they're concerned about it. Two, they want to do something about it. And three, they're not sure what to do. So that creates a unique opportunity in which we have kind of the foundation and the recipe to maybe start to do something. The next kind of foundational thought is that when you call something pollinator habitat, everybody immediately gets a picture in their mind of what that is and what it looks like. And usually, I always think it's informed by the photo that's on the calendar in your office when you flip it to the month of July. It's this like gorgeous flowering meadow or a picture like this. And we can produce that kind of habitat, but we need to remember that for native vegetation, native wildflower species, we kind of go through that. Year one, it sleeps. Year two, it creeps. Year three, it leaps, and that sort of thing. So that's why I'm so excited about Clint's research with his team, where they have, number one, a 5-year record, and number two, they've looked at over 290 sites throughout each of the bloom periods. That's an incredible data set, which gives us a really strong piece of information to look at. Perhaps what I think is one of the most important considerations is that when we get an acre of habitat, we simply have to make it the best it can be. Okay, so think about Clint's comments about preference, and then the analogy of the cinnamon roll analysis that we had in that presentation. We don't have enough good stuff on the landscape. Clint talked about how the engineered pollinator habitat was less than 1% of the landscape. And Clint, you might want to add and put the finer point on this, but it's less than 1%, and you didn't include ag land in that analysis, right?
Yeah, the analysis just actually, Pete, just kind of grassland and semi-natural covers. We don't include things that are in cropland and all that. If we did that, then, you know, it'd probably be I don't even know, 1/1000th of a percent of the total landscape that's out there. So exceptionally rare.
Yeah. And we need more of it. That's the long and short of it. So our viewpoint is we cannot afford to, when we have a pollinator habitat project going, to have it be kind of a, meh, yeah, it's okay, but could be better. We need to make it the very best that it can be. And the last couple of kind of foundational points is that we also have to really think about how to approach this with all hands on deck, working with all potential partners. And that's where, in my view, not only can agriculture be an important partner, but agriculture has to be an important partner for us to be a success. And this will probably come up in one of the questions, Clint. It usually always does. I personally believe that when I'll take an acre of pollinator habitat wherever I can get it on the landscape, I'll grab every one of them we can get, and then I want to focus on making it the best it can be. That means that I'll take it right next to the ag field, in this example, right next to the soybean field. And we'll probably talk about this more when it comes up in a question, but I believe that the benefits outweigh what the potential negatives are of having it right next to agriculture. And then one of the last things is we just need to seek opportunities to promote combined benefits. And solar energy was one of the examples that we talked about earlier. It's a unique, very specific kind of habitat that has to be designed. But what a great example of how we can combine multiple benefits for multiple species, grassland songbirds, monarch butterflies, native bees, honeybees, all kinds of pollinator species and other forms of wildlife. And again, when we get something like that, we need to make it the best it can be. And the last thought is that when we have thought about all of those approaches, we've been able to think about benefits for water quality, soil health, food sustainability, monarch butterflies, honeybees, grassland songbirds, and on and on and on and on and on, and renewable energy and all those things. And when you can uniquely touch all of those issues, we're able to combine a broad swath of the public that are interested in those same issues. So pollinators and their health and habitat needs are a really unique glue that can connect all kinds of interests out there. Last slide I have, Clint, is I want to challenge the folks that have been on here tonight. What can you do? Every single one of these things, I'm going to give you, I think, 4 things here. They won't cost you a penny, and every one of you can do this and it would be impactful. The first one is you see a solar energy project going into your state, your region, your county, your community, raise your hand and say, hey, is it going to be pollinator friendly? Find neighbors and other projects where there's an opportunity and connect them with the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund so we could help. If you're on this webinar tonight and you're part of a group or a community that would be interested in hearing more about this, hey, hit us up in the chat and let's co-host another webinar just like we're doing with Clint tonight. You have an event coming up where people would like to know more about how to get free seed and the one-on-one technical guidance, let us know. We'll send you a stack of flyers that promote the program and you can hand those out. And here's perhaps the simplest one. Everybody that's on here tonight has some technological capabilities. We're on all the social media platforms. Like and follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, all the other things that we're on out there, so that you can get more updates from us. And here's our contact information for tonight. You can hit us up. Certainly, we hope that you've had lots of questions in the Q&A in the chat. And right now we're going to turn it back to Elsa to help navigate us through some of the questions that are out there tonight.
Thanks, Pete. Well, you guys just knocked it out of the park there. There's a lot of questions coming in. So put your questions in the Q&A and we'll try and get to as many as we possibly can. But we are going to start out with a show me question, Pete, from Charlotte in Missouri. So her question is, are land management agencies understanding that in general, honeybees don't take food away from native bees? There's been an expressed concern that they can't coexist.
Mhm. Yep. So that answer is going to depend on which land management agency you're talking to in the public. I'm going to turn this over to Clint in a second. But before I do, I'll say there's more and more conversation about that. And what's driving that conversation and that concern is that the available great forage on the landscape. We're wildlife biologists. We call it habitat. If you're a beekeeper, you call it forage. The great forage and habitat on the landscape is getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and it's concentrating those species. So one of the things that the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund absolutely believes is that a rising tide floats all boats. When we get an acre of habitat, we need to make it the very best it can be. And that's going to help address some of those concerns. Clint, you want to add your expertise to that
I
question?
do. Yeah. And so kind of as an ecologist, Pete, we think about environmental carrying capacity. And as we lose forage, we're decreasing the capacity of that environment to harbor bees, both managed and wild. And then, so when we have limited forage on the landscape, then we do rightfully start talking about competition. And so through habitat restoration, that's where we can minimize any potential effect of competition. Now, my research, I don't want people to go away and say, oh, across the US, nothing to see here. There's no competition between managed bees and wild bees. No, you need to look at it spatially and you need to understand what's actually available out there for your bees. Of course, there's going to be competition if there's just one little patch of flowers out there in a sea of impervious surface and agriculture. Of course, there will be competition, but that's the point is we need more habitat for our bees. And we can then support a beekeeping industry and also support our wild bees. And again, just to highlight, bring it back to the USGS research specifically in the Northern Great Plains for our study, we're showing that there's a lot of plants that could be included in seed mixes. If people have a concern about potential competition, there are plants that are preferred by our native bees and not utilized so much by our honeybees that could absolutely be included in mixes if people have concern over competition. So there are definitely ways to minimize or sort of lessen the impact, but it absolutely starts with habitat. You got to have it on the landscape.
And I'll just add, we need more Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund acres. All right, Elsa.
On that note, Pete, this is probably a good question that segues right into that. Sabrina asks, has this research been shared with NRCS to enable them to adjust the conservation mix expectations? She has found in her personal experience that the NRCS has significant grasses in the pollinator mixes currently.
Absolutely. So as researchers, we do everything we can to put the information in the hands of the decision makers. And to that end, you know that fact sheet that Mary posted in the chat? We mailed, even not only emailed, but also sent physical copies, multiple physical copies to every USDA county office in our entire study region. So we mailed them out to make sure that the land practitioners, the land managers, actually have the information at their disposal. But it's absolutely a learning process. And so I would hope that if there are certain county offices that are curious about this research and want to learn more about designing more cost-effective pollinator habitat, I'd love to learn about those offices, and I'd be more than glad to share with them the results of our research, providing the papers and so forth. And I should also mention, in addition to sharing, mailing, we host a lot of webinars to USDA, and we get state and county representatives on those webinars. But of course, again, it's a learning process because we have a USDA county office in every county in the US. And so not all those people certainly can jump on those webinars, but it's a process of getting the information out there.
Yep. And behind the curtain, I'm going to ask if Mary hasn't done so to post in the chat or wherever we're doing it at the link to the pollinator habitat establishment and management guide. I didn't see it in there, so.
Thanks, Pete. I'm not sure, Mary, I think she might have already put it in there earlier, but she'll double check that.
One more time.
So there's a lot of questions.
Elsa,
Go ahead, Clint.
I was just
You got a
curious.
question?
I got the questions up and I was just curious. There's one from Janice Jackson about, I just want to comment since it seems pretty targeted on the research. And the question is, did the research distinguish between native bees since they are so different, such as generalists versus specialists? And I think that's an excellent question. One that we would like to take the research in that direction, but to answer Janice's question, no, we did not. I mean, we identified many of the bees that were visited on the flowers. Well, I shouldn't say many, we identified about half of them. But we did not then relate or calculate species specific selection ratios. Because frankly, we're just not there yet in terms of creating species specific mixes for our native bees. The exception being threatened and endangered species and species of conservation concern like monarchs, regal fritillary, rusty patch bumblebee. There we can have species specific mix, but for our other native pollinators, we're just not there yet in terms of kind of designing tailored mixes for individual species.
And the good thing towards that point, Clint, just about every one of those species that you mentioned, those species of concern, benefit from this kind of a habitat project because many of them are generalists. The rusty patch bumblebee,
yeah, completely
a generalist. The monarch butterfly would find all kinds of things out here from which to benefit from.
Yeah, I do. Another project we have going on is studying the endangered rusty patch bumblebee in the upper Midwest. And our secret is, hey, we go to the thistle patches to try to find rusty patch because that's where they tend to forage.
Yeah.
So Pete,
Not that you would plant non-native invasive thistle in bee and butterfly.
No.
They are generalists. They're absolutely generalists.
So Pete, the Minnesota project that's going on, what about their bumblebee finds? Why don't you share that?
I'm glad that you asked that. So in a future webinar that's coming up, I listed 4 research projects. One of them is with the University of Minnesota Bee Lab, and we designed seed mixtures that they established in 2018. So almost the same timeline and length of study as what Clint is looking at. And on those Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund designed projects, they have now identified 3 new bee records for the state of Minnesota. Okay. So if you're listening to that and you're like, what does that mean? I don't understand what that means. That means 3 native bee species never before in the history ever found in the state of Minnesota have been found on the seed mixtures that the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund designed and they planted and are studying. That is a great example of if you build it, they will come. And if it looks like this kind of quality of a project, that doesn't hurt either.
Well, Pete, we only have a few more minutes.
Elsa, I'm going to jump in and say that somewhere later this year, we will have a webinar with the University of Minnesota team as well. And sneak peek, Clint has already agreed that later this year, we'll do another one with him where maybe we just go into just the floral preference thing, and that's with his team as well.
Yeah, We could be here
This is
all
where you're
night.
supposed to nod your head, Clint, because you
Yes.
agreed earlier. Okay.
Yes.
So
So
as we're,
be watching for those, because I think from my perspective, I think the subject matter tonight is something that is of great interest to a lot of people.
well, we still have more questions, but I think we're gonna have to wrap it up. I'm gonna give you two more questions here. The Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund uses 2 seed mixtures. How did they come up with this idea and why?
Yeah. So how did we come up with this idea? It's about trying to benefit the widest swath of pollinator species out there with the floral options that we think they prefer and will use and benefit from the most. And the honeybee mixture and the monarch butterfly mixture are both highly preferred and highly used, but they establish and are managed very differently. So it's 2 separate plantings, not combined into one. And it's been very innovative, very unique, and it's producing significant results.
We have another bee question. I see bees all the time, but I don't know how to identify them. I don't know which bees they are, especially bumblebees. Is there any tips you could give us on how to identify bumblebees?
Yeah, specifically bumblebee, I would say for, the 4,000 native bee species in North America, you're going to have to get training in entomology and buy a nice microscope. But for bumblebees, here, can I share the screen?
Yep.
Pete? Okay.
Now you can. I just
All right.
stopped mine.
So bumblebees, check this out. So for folks that have bumblebees on their own property, or they're just out walking and they want to identify a bee, everyone's got a camera built into their handheld phone now. You can take a photo of a bee, and of a bumblebee, and it doesn't have to be a great photo. You can crop it on your phone, crop the image on your phone, and then upload it to this software, which is it's artificial intelligence. They call it.
We're not
Bee
seeing your
Machine.
screen yet, Clint.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So
There
the
we go.
website, so you can see Bee Machine. So this is artificial intelligence being used to identify bumblebees. Really cool stuff. And it works. It'll give you a probability of, like, based on the image you've provided, here's the likelihood that it's species X, Y, or Z. And it usually gets it in like the 99 percentile if you have a halfway decent photo. This is a cool way for people who got a little bit of pollinator habitat in their yard or in their neighborhood. If they want to get involved in learning more about bees, but they don't know what they're looking at, here's a great way to do it. So really cool tool that's just been around for the past year or so.
Yep. And I believe that a link to that is showing up in the chat right now. And I think that was the last question. And before I turn it over to Elsa, let me just say that everybody that registered for this webinar, you will, in probably about a week, you're going to get a follow-up email that will give you a link to this recording. Please feel free to share it with others. And I think that we're going to provide some more information about questions and other things, and Elsa's going to answer that right now.
Yep, we will. So that'll come out in an email to you. But Pete, there was one more question, and we had several folks were talking in the chat and in the questions about lawn to legumes type programs where they're doing some research on actual U.S. Department of Ag's doing research on garden plants, and there's just a bunch going on for smaller landowners. So a question that was brought up earlier that ties back to that is, I don't have 2 acres. What can I do?
Mm-hmm.
That'll be our last question. Then I'm finished. I'm out.
So the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund works on projects that are 2 acres and larger. That's just kind of the arena that we're playing in. That does not mean that backyard butterfly gardens and all kinds of things can't make a significant difference. And I'm going to turn it over to Clint to tell his personal story.
Yeah, because this came up in the last presentation as well. And you know, I have a little, maybe fifth of an acre in just a normal residential area. When my wife and I moved into our home, it was all turf grass and just rock sprayed with herbicide multiple times a year. And every year we just took a little bit of that rock out or converted a little bit of that turf grass over to pollinator habitat. And it's been so rewarding and welcoming to see the bees appear. They're coming from somewhere. We built the habitat, Field of Dreams, they came, you know, and now it's just every day I get home and just on my own little piece of land that I own, I get to, you know, support a lot of diverse bees and enjoy the flowers too, and get a lot of comments from neighbors because I get to sit out on the porch and drink tea instead of mow my lawn. And enjoy the flowers.
All right. Well, Clint, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this. As a young biologist that started my career in 1986 at Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center, I've always enjoyed chatting with you about that stuff and what's going on there and the history, the personal history that I have going back to that location. And I just really appreciate the passion that you bring to this issue that so many of us like. So thank you, my friend.
Hey, thanks, Pete. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to speak to your audience and converse with you about pollinator habitat. We'll certainly keep the conversation going, and I look forward to our next interaction.
All right. Thanks, everybody.